Caitlin Clark didn't raise her voice, but she didn't need to. Her silence towards Scott Agnes spoke volumes. When asked by other reporters, Clark offered thoughtful, articulate responses. But when it came time for Agnes, who'd previously published an unapproved injury update and criticized her supporters, she shut down, visibly cool, short on words, unwilling to play along.
If you're here for the real story and not the filtered version, subscribe. And if you're sticking around for the next meltdown, you better definitely subscribe.
It wasn't a meltdown or a feud. It was deliberate boundary setting. Her demeanor reflected a growing reality in pro sports. Athletes are no longer passive participants in press rooms. They're the ones deciding how the media game is played. What makes this moment so revealing is how clearly it exposes the tension between journalistic ambition and athlete autonomy. Agnes chose the scoop, breaking injury news and framing Clark's fan base in a controversial light. But in doing so, he fractured a critical relationship. That tension isn't just about personal fallout, it's structural. As athletes gain more visibility and platforms of their own, the cost of alienating them rises. Clark's controlled response demonstrates a new blueprint, where silence, not statements, speaks loudest, and where players don't just answer to the media, they redefine its reach. Caitlin Clark didn't raise her voice. She didn't storm off. She didn't even look particularly bothered. But with a few words, a flat tone, and a calculated lack of interest, she pulled off one of the most decisive public shutdowns of a journalist we've seen in pro sports this year. And Scott Agnes? He's now out of a job. No dramatic headlines. No social media takedown. Just an awkward press conference and a growing list of consequences. The message couldn't be clearer. Media access isn't guaranteed anymore. And if you compromise trust, you might not get a second chance. This confrontation between Clark and Agnes didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of a long simmering tension, sparked by a series of questionable reporting choices. Agnes had published sensitive details about Clark's team, specifically information about an injury the team wanted to keep quiet. That alone would be enough to rattle any relationship between a player and a journalist. But he didn't stop there. He also criticized Clark's fan base, a group known for their loyalty and vocal support. Whether Agnes meant to or not, his remarks landed as dismissive, and alienating a player's supporters is a quick way to destroy goodwill, especially when that player has become a cultural lightning rod. So when the next press conference rolled around and Agnes asked a question, Clark's response was calm, clipped, and cold. She answered briefly, with zero warmth, before moving on. Then, when another reporter asked something similar, her demeanor shifted completely. Friendly, engaged, thoughtful. That contrast didn't go unnoticed. It wasn't random. It was a deliberate line in the sand. Clark had decided how she was going to engage, and more importantly, who she was going to engage with. And that moment wasn't just a personal choice. It was a strategic decision. Because athletes like Clark aren't just playing sports anymore. They're managing brands, relationships, and media narratives. Every response, every pause, every glance send a message. Clark's message was this: if you cross certain boundaries, don't expect things to go back to normal. That's where the media world is now, shifting under the weight of athletes who are no longer dependent on traditional press to tell their stories. Players with massive fan bases and direct platforms can now dictate terms. They don't have to play nice with every journalist in the room, especially not ones who've jeopardized trust. Agnes's choice to publish that injury detail might have looked like a good scoop. From a traditional journalism perspective, he did his job. He reported new, relevant information. But in this new media landscape, that decision wasn't just about what he wrote. It was about what he risked. Because now, access is conditional. Relationships matter. Athletes are paying attention. And when you publish something that violates team confidentiality or paints fans in a negative light, the cost isn't just backlash. It's potentially losing your place in the room entirely. That's exactly what happened. Clark didn't need to launch a public campaign against Agnes. Her disengagement did the talking for her. And whether his firing was directly linked to her response or not, the optics are brutal. He lost trust. He lost access. And then he lost his job. And it's not just about him. This entire situation raises bigger questions about the role of sports journalism in 2025. Can reporters still break tough stories without destroying their relationships? Or has the balance shifted so far toward athletes that media coverage is becoming too cautious, too filtered, too curated? It's complicated, because on one hand, Clark's decision to draw that boundary is entirely understandable. When someone leaks sensitive info and then criticizes your supporters, you're under no obligation to engage with them the same way you would with someone who's shown respect. But on the other hand, if athletes only interact with media that treats them favorably, how long before coverage becomes toothless? If reporters are afraid of losing access, they may start self-censoring. And when that happens, journalism becomes PR. Still, Clark's actions reflect a broader trend: the athlete as gatekeeper. She's not the first player to leverage media interaction strategically, but the precision with which she handled it and the resulting fallout make this moment a case study in modern athlete power. She didn't lash out. She didn't escalate. She just cut the connection. And in the context of an increasingly conditional media landscape, that was more than enough. Athletes like Clark now operate with an understanding of soft power, how tone, presence, and public alignment shape perception. They know they don't need to be overtly confrontational to make a point. They just need to be deliberate. Her reaction to Agnes wasn't about pettiness. It was a statement of values: respect boundaries or face the consequences. It also highlighted how fragile the trust between athletes and reporters really is. Agnes's reporting wasn't illegal. It wasn't even inaccurate, but crossed the line. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. Not with Clark, not with her team, and certainly not with the fans. Because her fan base isn't just passionate, they're protective. When Agnes criticized them, he didn't just alienate Clark. He positioned himself as someone who didn't understand the ecosystem surrounding her. And in a media environment where public support can make or break a career, that kind of misstep is fatal. This entire episode is a reminder that access is earned, and it's not permanent. Athletes are no longer passive subjects of media attention. They're curators of their own image, gatekeepers of their own stories, and increasingly, enforcers of boundaries. That's not entitlement. That's evolution. And if journalists don't adapt, they risk becoming outsiders in an industry they use to control. So yes, Scott Agnes may have been doing his job. But in today's world, doing the job isn't just about reporting facts. It's about understanding impact. It's about knowing which doors will close when you hit publish. CC and Caitlin Clark just showed us how quickly and quietly those doors can shut. If you got thoughts on this one, jump in the comments and tell us. Was this a power play, a necessary boundary, or a sign that journalism is losing ground to brand management? Hit that like button, share this with a sports fan who's always defending their team in the group chat, and don't forget to subscribe. There's plenty more where this came from. The ripple effect from that one press conference hasn't just lingered, it's grown louder. Not because of anything Caitlin Clark said, but because of everything she didn't. Her cold interaction with Scott Agnes was only a few seconds long, but the consequences hit like a headline. And what made it even more impactful? The contrast. Right after she responded to Agnes with that deadpan tone and deliberate distance, she turned around and gave another reporter her full attention. Open body language, friendly energy, a detailed response. You didn't need a media degree to decode what was happening in real time. One reporter got the shutdown. Another got the star treatment. That split-second shift said more than any statement ever could. It told the entire media room and the internet watching afterward where Clark stands. It wasn't petty. It wasn't passive-aggressive. It was strategic, and it was loud. Scott Agnes, by all accounts, didn't lose his job because of one article. This wasn't a single-mistake scenario. His reporting on Clark's team, especially the sensitive injury information, violated an unspoken but essential rule in sports media. Don't burn the bridge you walk on for access. And even more, don't frame the fan base as a problem when that fan base is one of the most vocal, energized, and engaged in the league. In the old media world, access was a given. Athletes needed the press to shape their narrative. But that equation has flipped. Today's players aren't beholden to legacy media. They've got massive online platforms, direct relationships with fans, and the tools to communicate exactly what they want, without a reporter in the middle. And Caitlin Clark knows it. When she shut down Scott Agnes, she didn't just withhold a good quote. She revoked a level of access that many journalists rely on to maintain relevance. In that moment, she demonstrated that the power dynamic has shifted, and she's not just aware of it, she's wielding it with precision. Because let's be honest, Clark didn't snap. She didn't lose her temper. She chose to disengage. And that distinction matters. It's one thing for an athlete to be emotional. It's another thing entirely to respond with calculated control, especially when the cameras are rolling. What Clark did was subtle, but unmistakable. She sent a warning. Cross the line, and you're out. And while some people have tried to frame this as entitlement, what they're missing is the strategy behind it. Clark wasn't just protecting her own ego. She was protecting control over her story, over her team's dynamics, over how she and her community are represented in the media. The moment Scott Agnes published that injury detail, he shifted the conversation from journalistic integrity to relationship management. He prioritized the scoop over the long-term trust between reporter and athlete. And in this modern landscape, that's a risky play, because relationships are currency, and he just cashes in for a short-term headline. It's not just Clark either. This dynamic is spreading across sports. Athletes are taking control of how they're covered, and they're doing it without needing to raise their voice or file complaints. They just make it known, through silence, subtlety, and savvy media interaction, that certain lines can't be crossed. And when those lines are crossed, the consequences are swift. They're not always dramatic, but they're undeniable. Scott Agnes's firing might not have come with a press release that cited Clark directly, but the connection was obvious. The timing, the tension, the fact that this wasn't his first misstep. It all came together in a way that made his exit feel inevitable. Once you're frozen out by the most influential player in the room, the walls start closing and quickly. And this isn't about censorship. This is about consequence. If you're going to break a story that includes private, strategic information, especially in a team sport where that info affects gameplay, morale, and public perception, you'd better be ready for the fallout. You don't get to play both sides. Drop sensitive intel and expect business as usual next week. That's not how this works anymore. Clark isn't just shaping her image. She's shaping the media landscape around her. And other athletes are watching, because what she did wasn't just a reaction. It was a blueprint. If you're a player with a brand to protect, a fan base to maintain, and a team you ride for, you now know you don't have to clap back online. You don't have to ask for someone's removal. All you have to do is disengage. Make the room uncomfortable. Choose where your energy goes, and the consequences will follow. It's soft power, turned up to 11. But here's the deeper issue. Where does this leave journalism? If athletes can't effectively blacklist reporters for crossing lines, do we lose the kind of fearless reporting that holds power accountable? Or, on the flip side, has journalism failed to evolve in a way that respects the modern dynamics between athlete and media? Because let's face it, some journalists are still clinging to outdated models. The idea that access is permanent, that athletes are supposed to take it no matter how invasive or tone-deaf the coverage gets. That clicks justify the erosion of trust. That world is gone. What replaces it is more complex. Reporters now have to walk a tighter line. They need to think not just about whether something is newsworthy, but whether it's worth it. Is the story valuable enough to risk future interviews? Will breaking the news now cost them a seat at the table later? It's not an easy calculation. But Clark's press conference gave us a clear answer. If you don't consider the long-term relationship, you might not have one. This doesn't mean journalism has to bow to athletes. But it does mean journalists have to understand that trust is now part of the job. You want access? You want insight? Then you need to build and protect those bridges. And once you burn them, there's no guarantee you'll get back in. Caitlin Clark didn't need to control the headline. She just had to control the moment. Her brief, controlled interaction with Scott Agnes did more to shape the narrative than any interview or article ever could. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was louder than any outburst. And the lesson is clear. Reporters are no longer just observers. They're participants. And the moment they forget that, they risk becoming the story themselves. Scott Agnes became the story. And Caitlin Clark? She walked away from the press table with her message intact, her image reinforced, and her power fully understood. The fallout from Caitlin Clark's icy press conference moment didn't just expose a single reporter. It exposed the entire fragile structure holding up modern sports media. Because whether Scott Agnes realized it or not, he stepped into a space where the rules had already changed. And Caitlin Clark? She knew exactly how to use those rules to her advantage. This wasn't a scandal. It was a shift, one that proved athletes today are no longer subjects of the media. They're co-authors of their own stories, and sometimes the final editors too. Let's be clear, what Clark did wasn't emotional. It wasn't fueled by ego or drama. It was precise. It was thoughtful. And it was the result of a pattern, a response to a breach of trust that had been building long before that moment in front of the cameras. Because trust in a media-athlete relationship is everything. It's the currency reporters trade for access, and it's the foundation athletes rely on to speak candidly. Once it's broken, the consequences aren't just awkward. They're professional. Agnes didn't just report on an injury. He published information the team had intentionally kept private. That's a line that, once crossed, can't be uncrossed, especially not when it involves a star player whose performance, reputation, and connection with fans directly impact league visibility. And then there were the comments about the fan base, Clark's fan base, which has been one of the driving forces behind her meteoric rise. They're loud. They're loyal. They show up. So when a reporter criticizes that community, it's not just an offhand opinion. It's a shot at the entire ecosystem surrounding her. What Agnes may have underestimated is how much weight that ecosystem holds. Clark isn't just an athlete. She's a brand, a movement, a figure whose name trends regularly, whose jersey sales break records, and whose press room presence draws more cameras than some NBA players. When you jeopardize the trust of someone with that level of influence, you don't just lose an interview, you risk your role in the story altogether. And that's exactly what happened. When Clark responded to Agnes with a brief, disengaged reply, then shifted immediately to a warmer, more open interaction with another reporter, it was a textbook example of what controlled media management looks like in 2025. No statements, no feuds, just optics, just posture, and the press room understood. That kind of shift doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It reverberates, because everyone else in that room, every writer, every broadcaster, every camera operator, knows what they just witnessed. They saw the difference. They heard the subtext, and they'll carry that with them into their own reporting. This is the new game, strategic media engagement. Clark isn't the only athlete doing it, but she's one of the clearest examples of how it works. She rewards journalists who show respect, who understand the boundaries, and she withholds access from those who don't. Simple as that. And here's where it gets even more complicated, because Clark didn't just act for herself. Her silence toward Agnes was also a defense of her team, her fan base, and every player watching who's been burned by opportunistic reporting. Her response was quiet, but it was collective. She didn't speak for the WNBA, but she certainly reflected what many have felt. When athletes are reduced to headlines, when injuries are exposed without consent, and when communities of support are treated like problems instead of assets, players remember. And they respond in the one place they still fully control, the press conference. It's no longer about yelling or drama. It's about engagement. Who gets it and who doesn't? And Agnes? He didn't. The aftermath of that moment wasn't theatrical. There was no outcry, just silence. And then, eventually, reports that he was let go. No explicit connection to the Clark incident was made, but no one needed it spelled out. The dots were there, and they weren't hard to connect. The power athletes now have to shape coverage is immense. And Clark showed how to use it without ever stepping outside the bounds of professionalism. She didn't need a mic drop. She didn't need a quote. Her actions spoke louder than anything else in that room. And what's happening now is bigger than just one firing. This is about the recalibration of sports journalism. Reporters are being forced to reconsider what kind of stories they pursue and how they pursue them. Because the old get the scoop at all costs model doesn't hold up when access is no longer given. Publish a damaging piece today, and you may lose your seat tomorrow. Is that fair? That depends on who you ask, but it is the reality. Athletes have figured out that silence can be louder than outrage. A lack of eye contact, a shift in tone, a polite but pointed refusal to elaborate. That's all it takes now. And when the audience sees it, they feel it. They know who's in and who's out. And fans? They play a role too. Clark's base isn't passive. They saw how she treated Agnes, and many applauded it. Because in their eyes, she wasn't being difficult. She was standing her ground, protecting the integrity of her team, drawing a line that too often gets ignored when media oversteps. And if you look at it from that angle, Clark's actions weren't just calculated, they were justified. We've seen this shift coming for a while. From players skipping interviews to entire leagues reevaluating media access rules. The days of unchecked reporting freedom are gone. What replaces it is a more fragile, conditional kind of relationship. One where trust is king, and every question carries weight. Agnes's situation is a cautionary tale, not just for how fast things can unravel, but for how invisible the line can be until you've already crossed it. He didn't shout. He didn't lie. But he overstepped, and Clark, without raising her voice, responded in kind. Now, other journalists are watching and adjusting because the athletes have leverage now, and they're using it not to control truth, but to control trust. If you respect the line, you get access. If you don't, you're left outside. And in a media world where visibility equals relevance, that's a price not everyone can afford. The debate will continue about whether this trend threatens journalistic independence or whether it's a necessary correction to years of imbalance. But for now, one thing is clear. The game has changed, and Caitlin Clark didn't just play it. She defined it. Let's know where you land on this one. Are athletes like Clark redefining media relationships for the better, or making it harder for reporters to do their jobs? Was Agnes wrong to publish what he did, or just doing what journalists are supposed to do? Sound off in the comments. Hit that like button if you're still stunned by how fast things unfolded, and don't forget to subscribe. This story's not over, and the next press room drama could be just one cold answer away.